shamanic practitioner. Stacey started her career in service of Mother Nature with a bachelor's degree in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology, and spent 6 years working in the field as a wildlife biologist. She then graduated from the Colorado State Certified Occupational School in Shamanic Arts. She pairs over 10 years of shamanic study with her knowledge gained from working with wildlife, ecosystems, and rescue animals. She is the sole proprietor of Wild Gratitude Shamanic Healing Services based in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. Thank you, and happy birthday.
Yes, thank you all for coming on Earth Day and celebrating in this way. I wanted to start first by telling a story very similar to one I'm sure many of you have heard. And it's the story I start the book with. And one of the reasons why, a good example of why I entered into initially the field of environmental sciences, because I was interested in helping endangered species and ecosystems in peril. So the story starts out off the coast, off the west coast, out on an island. And in the 70s, there was a company that was producing DDT, and they dumped DDT out into the ocean, into the Pacific Ocean, in barrels, in closed barrels. But the barrels, of course, leaked, so the DDT contaminated the channel that was between the coastline and some islands. And there were bald eagles that lived on those islands and fished in the ocean. And obviously the DDT had an effect on their eggshells. I'm sure many of you have heard that story with peregrine falcons and bald eagles. And the bald eagles weren't able to reproduce anymore. So what happened is they declined their population on these islands, and some golden eagles moved in. And the difference between the golden eagles and the bald eagles is that the golden eagles were land predators rather than fishermen like the bald eagles were. And that was a problem for a species of fox that lived on the island. There are a unique subspecies or species of fox within each island. It was a chain of islands that I was on and that the story takes place on. There was a unique subspecies on each island. And they had been naive to aerial predators. So these golden eagles came in and took the populations down on some of the islands from 700 down to, we're talking like probably 12 foxes altogether. So action was taken and the foxes were moved into captivity. And that's where I enter in on the scene and my place in the story. And I had always wanted to, I've been doing wildlife research out in the field, sampling, counting birds, collecting data, that kind of thing, writing papers. And I was really interested in doing some direct, hands-on type of work. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity to go and work in this captive breeding program for these foxes. And what ended up happening is I ended up living on an island 8 days at a time all by myself. There was no trees on the island, there was no motorized vehicles on the island. The only way on and off the island was a dirt airstrip. And the plane came once a week if the weather was good. So I kind of got into a whole situation that I hadn't been expecting. And had, the foxes were pretty simple to take care of. It was arduous. I had to walk 4 to 6 miles a day carrying heavy buckets full of food and big water bottles for them. And then it was, not a lot of gratitude from the foxes. They would hide out in their pens, and I wasn't supposed to interact with them anyways. We didn't want to acclimatize them to humans. So I had a lot of time on my hands. And it was during this time that I was very obviously lonely and looking for some connection. And I was really fortunate that there were some northern harrier hawks that came out to the island and were setting up residence out there. They ended up nesting out there the summer I was out there for the first time in recorded history. And so they'd never been recorded there before nesting. And they were nesting right around where I lived. So every day on the walks I took, I was accompanied by them. there was a particular female who would fly right at my left shoulder every morning that I was walking down to check the harbor. And so this really got me questioning, and it was my first opportunity really to really connect with and be in conversation with wild animals without having to be the scientist, without having to be the observer outside of the situation. And so when you think about it, and how many times we've heard the story of these kind of ecological tragedies, and then, you know, the types of people, all the people that go in to move and help out with this kind of thing. And how many documentaries have been made, how many pleas for funding to help this endangered species or this captive breeding program. But I'm here as I talk about my direct interactions with the wild carrier hawks. I'm here to pose the question, what if this was more than just putting a cap on the growth of our cities? And what if this was more than turning down our hunger for natural resources? And is there something we can read into the bigger picture, more on a spiritual or soul level? Because that's what I felt calling when I had that experience with the hawks out on the island where I was interacting with them on a daily basis. So I'm going to share a short bit from the book about what it looks like to read deeper into that. And also, too, I started out on the island talking about these harrier hawks that came there and how well they were doing in their nests. There was 3 nests and they all hatched their young. There was only 1 adult egg, so the egg that didn't hatch. But everything else, all of the other ones hatched and survived and fledged. So I knew from my years of schooling and time in the field that fledgling success this high was uncharacteristic. Harrier nests are vulnerable to ground predators, so they choose nesting sites that are in areas of low ground predation pressure. Harriers also select nest sites based on prey availability, and the deer mouse population was booming since there was no wild foxes there to prey on them. In the end, this was a typical scenario in ecology. A niche is left open and another species moves in to fill it, but the story takes on an entirely different meaning in another realm. When looking into spiritual teachings of various tribal cultures, Jamie Sams and David Carson, authors of Medicine Cards, suggest that contrary fox, so I would call the foxes in cages, contrary fox, is as foolish as it is cunning. And you may have fooled yourself into believing that your low self-esteem is due to your being born plain or having an ordinary life. This is camouflage of a different sort, in that you have camouflaged your true desire to experience life with friends, with joy, and with purpose. In any case, you are put on notice to be aware of apathy and self-induced boredom. You may have to dig deeply to find what excites you enough to scurry across the wasteland of your dulled senses and live. Like most people on the planet, I had masked my true self with a camouflage made of the drama of familial relationships, obsession with career goals, and worry over monetary gain. Out on the island, I had none of these distractions. I was in the wasteland of my dull senses. I was stripped down to the core of who I was and had only the voices in my head to keep me company. Just like the foxes on the island, my camouflage could no longer run wild in my life. Luckily, I didn't have to seek out what would rouse me out of boredom. Excitement flew to me across the ocean. I found that according to many authors, including Jessica Dawn Palmer, author of Animal Wisdom, the hawks are symbolically seen as messengers of the gods and are honored for their keen vision. Through my relationship with the harriers, I received the message and the vision of what it is like to actually be a part of the natural world. These moments were fleeting, but brought plenty of incentive to follow this particular vein of being. My almost daily interactions with the hawks convinced me that my life was much more than ordinary. With that realization came an overwhelming sense of responsibility. If I had something out of the ordinary to offer the world, then I had an obligation to share it. I understood why I and most other people in the world clung greedily to our camouflage. It was daunting to consider the path ahead. I would have to put my heart and soul on the line, to find my purpose and live it. If I failed, the results could be catastrophic. My preoccupation with finances and social status were merely surface concerns. I was safe under those pretenses, succeed or fail. Time after time, I wanted to forget that I was witnessing what I was witnessing and slip back into the cozy, comatose existence I'd lived my entire life. Then a harrier would cross my path, and my spirit would wander with her. Harriers are apart from most hawks, we know, in that they spend most of their time actively coursing over the landscape. They do not sit on perches patiently waiting for prey to appear. They are out looking and listening for their next meal. In similar fashion, I walked hundreds of miles during my time on the island without ever actually getting anywhere in particular. Often I wondered what the use of such wandering was, until I was caught up in the magnificent simplicity of a blossom by my feet, the dazzling color patterns on a lizard's back, or the haunting song of a meadowlark. These were the meals that nourished my soul. What was the presence of the harriers telling me about my own evolution? First of all, the contrary camouflage of fox, my social conditioning, had been caged. Second, the medicine of mouse became prolific. As Jamie Sams and David Carson discussed, mouse energy is about focusing in on the details. It was the magic of details that I thrived on, just as the hawks thrived on the mice. This island was overflowing with tiny miracles. All I had to do was show up and to take note. Around the same time the immature harriers began life on their own, the fox pups began to show their precious faces. First, I would just catch a glimpse of their fuzzy bodies scrambling into the dens, the cloud of dust lingering after they were gone, but their natural cat-like curiosity began to get the best of them. They started by sitting motionless in the back of their pens, constantly checking with Mom and Dad to make sure they were safe. Then when the young ones realized I was the one who brought the mouth-watering quail and thrilling live mice, they anticipated my arrival. I was once sad and overjoyed to watch the pups grow. Sad was the possibility that they could spend their entire lives in captivity, and joyous was the knowledge that their unique role in the world would play out for another generation. Admittedly, it was satisfying to finally see appreciation in the foxes' faces for the hundreds of miles and hours I had put in to care for them. The parents would occasionally look up at me while their pups feasted as if to take in a sigh of relief and say, "Thank you." I was humbled, and I extended my gratitude for the opportunity to have a window into their lives, but my sense of remorse over being among their captors never subsided. The majority of the fox pairs were without carefree pups, and they went on staring through the walls of their cages in quiet disdain. I was continually ashamed of my species for the selfishness and cowardice that led to the environmental disaster and the imminent decline of the foxes. Had the human race not masked their own inner fears with materialism and conquest, the amazing gifts these foxes had to offer, the world would not be in peril. And I share this because I really think we have the opportunity to investigate environmental crises that are happening in our ecosystems, even here around us in this beautiful place, in a similar way. I think it's very important, very, very important to donate your time and money to help pick up trash, plant native vegetation, remove invasive species, and maintain trails so more people can enjoy and connect with the natural world. It is even more important to conserve water and increase our reliance on alternative energy, all these things that we're hearing about today on Earth Day. I too am passionate about buying local, organic food and growing my own however I can. I don't eat factory farmed meat either. All of these things help make a difference. But I really would like to encourage that there's even more we can do in terms of looking at this on a deeper level, looking at what's going on as a metaphor for what's, what is on the outer can also be on the inner, and the solution can also present itself in that way. And while I was out on the island doing that work with these animals, I really felt that calling to move into something deeper and connect with the animals beyond just them as numbers on a page or even as patterns on a graph. And so I ended up going back into society. So you hear a lot of people like Farley Mowat and Henry David Thoreau that have a similar calling to go into the wild and connect with it on a deep, deep level and have, contemplative time all the time out in nature. And I deeply respect the role they played and the literature they were able to offer gives us a window into that. But I really wanted to be back in society with my family and with my friends, and somehow wanted to connect this all together. And during that search, I had the great opportunity of volunteering. I was living back on the mainland again, and I started volunteering at a wildlife rehabilitation center. So they took in injured and orphaned wildlife and helped rehabilitate them for release back into the wild. And there were a particular set of ambassador birds. They were birds of prey that were handicapped and couldn't be released back into the wild. So they had been trained to work on the glove with humans and go to schools and clubs and things like that to help raise awareness about birds of prey and their importance in ecosystems. And it was at this time that I had the great synchronicity of, so out on the island, those harriers had come out there to nest for the very first time. And when I showed up at this wildlife rehabilitation center, they had a northern harrier hawk in their program. And it's very, very rare to see harrier hawks in falconry programs because more typically you're going to see red-tailed hawks or great horned owls, things like that. So it turned out that this bird was there. Her name was Talia, and she needed a handler. She didn't have someone to work with her on a regular basis. So I took up that role, and I wanted to share with you the fun experience of the first time that I got to fly her. So she didn't have full flight capabilities because of her handicap, but she still could fly some distance. So we did that for exercise and for some enrichment for her. And when we flew the birds, we would fly them on a tether. And so this is that piece of the story. I walked in an arch, so she started back. I had her set on a perch. I walked in an arch to a point 20 to 25 feet away and turned my back to the bird. I kept my hands in front of me and out of her view while stuffing a large chunk of meat into my gloved hand. I double-checked the line to make sure it was firmly under my left foot. Both of my feet were firmly planted in the grass, shoulder width apart. There was little room for doubt here. Talia wouldn't think of flying towards a shred of fear. I took a breath in and let it out, feeling my energy sink into the ground. If I'm going to be a raptor perch, I need to stand rooted like a tree, I thought to myself. I raised my left hand out parallel to the ground, held steady, looked over my left shoulder, and whistled. Talia crouched, her body 10 foot live. Every feather on her body lay smooth, and the instant before her wings extended and her legs pushed off. Now she was 5 times the size I'd ever seen her before. I stood from the perspective of a mouse, surprised to a standstill. Her wings drew in and out with my breath. 1 beat and a quick glide. 2 beats and I could feel her stare penetrate my soul. Stretched across my entire line of vision was this fabulous creature. Just as I was sure she was coming straight at my head, she rotated a fingertip. The sound of her feet hitting my glove was deafening. The clutch she had on my hand was crushing. I reminded my lungs to draw in air while the huntress devoured her prey. This was a split in the canvas where the world around was no more, and I stood with both feet in another. Here was the infinite spirit I knew lived within this crippled body. Through this vision, she'd offered me a direct link to the vastness beyond the mundane, a sense of hope which I hadn't felt since I couldn't remember, and that sense of hope welled into the beaming smile on my face. I now held in my heart a true vision of my own soul, along with that of my dear friend. She had leapt over that last gap between my true promptings and myself. What a miraculous gift. And so it was around this time that I started working with Talia that I had the fortune of meeting a shamanic practitioner and healer. And so I started studying with her and learning about shamanism, and so very brief introduction to shamanism is it's an ancient practice that goes back on every continent, down every one of our lineages, tens of thousands of years. It's an earth-based spirituality, essentially. Many of you have probably heard about power animals or totem animals, and that's one big part of shamanism is working with power animals. And another big part is the shamanic journey, which is otherwise known as soul flight. The idea of going on a walkabout. And it's, when we have a dream and when we dream in our sleep, we don't usually have control over what's going on, and we aren't usually conscious of the fact that we're dreaming. We're just in the dream. Sometimes we have that lucid dream where we have the experience of waking, being awake in the dream and realizing we're dreaming, and we can change things as they're unfolding. A shamanic journey is like that all the way through. So we go with intention on a shamanic journey into other realms, other worlds, mystical worlds, and do that in a way where we both surrender to and direct the experience at the same time. And then in those journeys we have conversations with power animals, with different guides, do healing, get guidance, those types of things. So it's a really rich tool, something to explore for an entire lifetime, many lifetimes for sure. And so it was around this time that I had the experience to learn how to do shamanic journeys of my own. And so as I was having experiences with the animals that were coming in at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, I was also doing journeys and talking with the spirit of these animals or their counterpart in the mystical realm. So there was a lot of overlap there in the symbology and life force that were coming through. And I obviously the whole time was really curious about my experience with Talia and the Harriers, and how they had come initially out on the island, and then how I met her at this Wildlife Rehabilitation Center a couple states away. So I really finally got up the courage to go ahead and do a journey on this, and that is this part of the story. I accepted a part-time position as a vet tech at Willowbrook Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The vision I had in my heart was coming into being. On a daily basis, I came into contact with handfuls of new animals. Each had their own story and brought their own teaching into my life. I was able to use my soft hands to help undo what a careless human had done. I was able to use my open heart to carry through whatever message each animal had to offer. My spiritual transformation began to accelerate. As I worked to help heal each individual, the stories the animals carried healed another part of me. I was able to honor my spirit guides by meticulously caring for their incarnate counterparts. Ordinary reality and the spirit realm began to blend. There was still one unfinished piece, my relationship with Talia. I often wondered what the purpose of her life was, why she had been in servitude to humans despite her best efforts, and why we seemed destined to meet. It slowly became more and more evident that Talia's time in this world was short. I decided to do a life purpose journey for her and learn the most during the time we had. So this is the journey. I was standing on the runway of the island, saddened by the silence, with my horse, cougar, and Black Panther. There were no harriers there now. We all walked to the point I used to visit every morning to look over the harbor. There I sat on some rocks and looked out over the ocean. Talia came and stood next to me, perched on the rocks. I cried cleansing tears for a short time, then turned to look over my shoulder. Talia had moved. She was perched atop the solid rock cross that had marked a Spanish conquistador's claiming of the island for his country. Panther looked over at me and told me that this was the symbol of Talia's life purpose, her standing on that cross. Panther also told me that I had brought the wild back to the spirit of the island with the coming of the harriers, and that I must now bring back the wild to a harrier spirit. I wondered if the panther had things inside out and backwards. The Harriers brought the wild back to the spirit of the island, and this Harrier was bringing back the wild to my own spirit. Maybe he worded things this way for a reason. I was starting to see that the story was woven tighter than I thought. I was the spirit of the island. I was a wild Harrier. I was Talia, and she was me. She was the spirit of the island trapped under the whims of conquistadors, ranchers, and careless human beings. She was the spirit of the island that could never be owned. She was a wild northern harrier that flew over oceans. She was a quiet woman buried under the guise of human civilization, a system that staked a claim on her own soul. The story of her release from human conquest was my story of liberation. So I still feel like I'm learning more and more about this every day, and that is that there's more of myself I can give and more that I can take in terms of this. I go outside for 5 minutes and see something that I know I can take the time to add it to my contemplative practice and learn more about what's going on in the inner and what I can shift to help the world in the outer. Nature gives us the answer on what we need to heal within ourselves and what we need to heal to help the whole, because what is in one is in the whole. And then connecting on a deeper level. There's so many ways that walks in nature, bird watching, fishing, all of those kind of things can help fuel us and help us connect on a deeper level. And one way, very good way, is like I shared with the foxes, working with the animals in metaphor and symbolism and taking the messages that way. But there is also this work that it points, ultimately what it does is points to what we can change within ourselves so that we can be better people in the world and live a more authentic life. And then as we're living more authentically, then we are open and empty and ready for the connection with the wild animals. I believe that when we used to live in a world without walls and cement, that we had an opportunity to connect much more with the wild ones than we do now. And so there's more effort that we have to put in. But I strongly feel that if we take the initiative to make this change within ourselves and connect within ourselves, then we can start shifting consciousness altogether. Because really, choices and policies aren't going to change in the world unless we see the animals as part of ourselves, unless we see ourselves in the hawk and the hawk sees us in them. So, thank you all very much. So there's a number of ways that you can encounter and befriend power animals. You can do it on journeys of your own, in dreams. I think I mentioned cougar in that journey too. Yeah, I had a cougar initially show up in real life. Actually, my first experience with I had a face-to-face, one-on-one. I was by myself encounter with the cougar, and so then cougar started showing up in my dreams. And but you can also have a shamanic practitioner do a power animal retrieval for you. So they'll go and ask for a power animal that would like to come and help you at this time. And then whoever shows up is who you get. And there's all this whole thing about ownership of power animals, and I don't really think there's any that are mine or anybody else's in particular. This is ones I work with more frequently, and they come and go. There's some that I've worked with my whole entire practice of doing this, and there's others that come in for a few months and then leave back out of the story. The Black Panther is an interesting one because she initially showed up as a power animal for Talia, the hawk, and then after Talia passed away, which I share in the story, we had a black. I was thinking about getting a cat. I'd never owned a cat because used to be allergic to them. At the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, we had a black cat show up, a stray show up. So that was another one of those synchronicities that came in the story. So she's still with us, and yeah. Other questions, or yeah?
You mentioned that one might find someone to help you take concept and knowledge. How did you do that?
Yes.
How did you go about that?
I have done a couple years worth of training. So I went to a shamanic arts school and trained with a teacher because that was the path that I chose to take. But many people, they take a lot of their direction and training from the spirits themselves. So they have a spirit come to them very strongly and they decide they just want to train in non-ordinary reality with the guide that way. So there's a lot of different ways to learn, and there's way more books out there now about how to do shamanic journeys and these kind of things than there used to be. And I teach workshops, and there's a lot of other folks that do too on how to do this and things like that. So it's gaining in popularity, definitely, which is great.